So I think about that from guesting and having guests on is it's amazing that you have the opportunity to be on more shows and have more guests on, but it just might not be as valuable as it once was. Doesn't mean it's not worth doing. Doesn't mean it shouldn't be a strategy that you're practicing. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do it consistently. I think all of those, you should be doing them. It just might not have the same return on investment that it once did. Podcast Growth Nation, welcome back to another episode of Podcast Growth University, where we talk all things podcasting all the time. I hope you enjoyed last week's episode, and I hope it was valuable. I know some of us know about what we talked about, but I want to make sure I did an episode on it just in case. Even if it's only one person who didn't know, that's a win for me. So last week, we talked all about one spot you need to be looking at but may not know about. Technically, I think it was 2 spots, but I always try to give more than the title suggests. Today, for episode number 102, how guest interviews are changing. Very excited to do this episode. If you have not yet, and you would so kindly subscribe, I would appreciate it very much. You're a podcaster. You ask your audience to subscribe, obviously, and you know the importance of it because we've talked about it before. So if you find value in PGU, it would mean the world to me if you would give us a subscription. All right. How guest interviews are changing. I've been having a lot of conversations with newer podcasters. Podcasts that have been started within the last year, maybe 50 episodes and under. And the questions that I get are often, well, what did you do in the beginning? And what are the things that you wish you did? And how have things changed? And what are you doing today? And all of these different questions. And this is the interesting thing. What we're doing today isn't necessarily the best advice to give someone else. Just like from a fitness standpoint, you might see somebody eating a pizza and they might be in really good shape, and you might think to yourself, well, they're eating a pizza, I'm going to eat a pizza and I'm going to get in really good shape. But they might know exactly how many calories are in that pizza. It might fit their macros and what they need. They may have not eaten all day. Maybe they ran a marathon earlier that day. You don't really know. So just because somebody is doing something today does not mean that is the best thing for you to be doing today. And the reason I say that is multifold, but we don't have guests. So Podcast Growth U, we actually are going to probably have a guest or two in the near future. I'll talk about that a little bit at the end. But Next Level University, we have not had a guest in like over 1,000 episodes. I couldn't remember. Maybe it was like 700, 800 the last time we had guests. So it's been over 1,000 episodes since we've had a guest. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't be having guests, because we're not. We are probably hurting our growth by not having guests. It's just the way we want to do it. So that's part one, how guest interviews are changing. In the beginning, pretty much everybody was doing guest interviews. In the very beginning, that was pretty much it. Everybody was doing guest interviews to some degree. Now, a lot of people aren't. I have many clients who have not done a guest episode yet, and they've only done solo episodes. I have many other clients who have only done solo guest episodes and haven't done solo episodes. There's more flexibility, I think, now than there ever has been. That's not one of the points I was going to make, but that's something I'll start off with. So this is an interesting thing that I think we're going to start to see happening more and more as podcasts get bigger and bigger. When we would have guests on in the past, our self-improvement podcast is a holistic one. So holistic meaning health, wealth, life, and love. We would have someone on that might have an expertise in, health. But by curiosity and by having an hour booked and wanting to fill that hour, we might ask them what their relationship advice would be. Or we might ask them what their money advice would be. And we got to a point in time where we started to realize that if we didn't have someone who had a unique area of expertise that we could stay focused on for the entire episode, it kind of felt like we were selling the audience short. If we're having somebody on who knows a lot about A, but then the conversation starts veering off into B, C, D, E, and F, but they don't really know that much about those things. I'm not saying they don't know, but it's not vetted. The information isn't vetted. This, I think, is going to continue changing with people, where you have to be very careful with what you produce in terms of what your guest says. Because if somebody is an expert in one field, it does not mean they're an expert in other fields. And people have been treating it that way for many years, where if somebody is really good at nutrition, they'll talk to them about something else, when they might not know that much about that something else. So guest interviews are changing in a unique way where it's almost becoming more and more and more and more of the host's responsibility to make sure the episode stays on path, it stays on topic, and you utilize the guest to the best of your ability. I'm very guilty of this in the past, and that's why we stopped having guests, because I didn't want to have to walk that line. We had guests on that were really good at one thing, the conversation switched into something else, and they said stuff that I didn't necessarily agree with, / just aren't true. And at the time, I didn't have the courage to challenge that on the podcast episode. And then it got to the place where we said, honestly, I don't really want to do that. I don't want to do that publicly. I'm going to feel like a jerk if I do that publicly in front of people, and then then am I going to edit that out? I don't really want to do that. I want to be authentic. I want to be truthful. I want to have a real conversation. So we stopped having guests. That might not apply to you, because maybe you have a basketball show and you only have people on that talk about basketball. I don't know, but different guests have different expertises. And when we cross the conversation over from one genre or one category or whatever it is to another, things can get messy. There are quite literally people making a living out of this online, where they claim to be nutritionists or whatever it is, and they're not, but people ask them questions on it, and that's the content that goes, and it's a dangerous game. There's a lot of clickbait and a lot of, the 15 seconds from the interview that sounds a certain way gets people talking. So just something to be aware of. I'm not saying you shouldn't have guests. I'm not saying you shouldn't listen to what your guests say. I'm not saying any of that. I'm just saying be very careful, because at the end of the day, as a host, it is your responsibility to make sure that the content that you put out there is the most truthful content to you. Whatever that means, morally, ethically, at least that's my belief. So that's one thing. I think that's going to start changing in the podcast space. I've seen a lot of YouTube videos about this. Like, people are really noticing that just because this person knows real estate, they don't necessarily know anything about fitness. So why are we asking them about fitness if they don't know anything about it? Potential dangerous game. And again, not everybody's going to tell you the truth. One of my lines that I've been using a lot recently is, I have not done enough research to effectively speak on that topic. If you were to ask me about, email marketing, I know something, maybe more than your average person, but I don't know enough to make a course about it. I don't know enough for somebody to pay me to do a coaching call on it. I'm not an email marketing guy. I haven't done the research or have the experience necessary to speak or lead effectively on that. But not everybody's going to say that. So that's number one. Number two, since there are way more podcasts, that means that people are getting asked a lot more to be guests on podcasts. So I remember we had a guest on, and this was probably in maybe the early 40s for us, early 40s episodes. So maybe like 2018, 2019. We had a guest on, and at the time, I think this guest had like 155,000 followers on Instagram, and there was almost no long-form video content of this person on their page. They just hadn't done it. They hadn't been on any podcast. They didn't do any speaking. They were a fitness brand. So we interviewed this person, and we made a nice teaser clip for him, and we sent it to him. This was before Instagram collaborations were a thing. And we tagged them and all that stuff. And they ended up sharing it on their story. And I remember checking a few hours later, and we already had like 4,000 views, 4,000 listens on that episode. So having this person on was really good because nobody else had really interviewed them, and their audience was hungry for their content. Now, it's kind of different because think of it this way. So I've gone on many shows who will say, well, I really hope you'll share the content I create. And I say, I'm happy to share it. I'm happy to share it. If you make me a collaborator, if it's good, high quality content, I'm happy to put it on my page. I'll always add it to my story. But I always tell people this: my audience doesn't really care. And here's the reason. I do 7 episodes a week, so it's not like they haven't heard my story or my beliefs or my opinions or whatever. They hear me talk as often as they want. My audience probably isn't going to be a conversion audience for you.
Hey, I wanted to give my experience working with Kevin and the rest of the Next Level University team. It has been such a seamless relationship. He is so easy to work with, Kevin, and he gives you all the information you need, but doesn't overwhelm you. He's also meets you where you're at. So whatever you want to do, he'll make it work. And it's just, there's no stress, there's no drama. And everybody else that I've worked with has been patient with me because I am not technologically savvy. So they've been helpful and patient and just encouraging. And it's just been a fantastic experience. I highly, highly recommend working with them.
Because some people care less now about other people being on shows because it's not as novel. It's not as novel. Next week, I'm actually going to talk about a unique way to get more listens and exposure to a new audience, tapping into some of the things we're talking about today. But yeah, if you've been on 800 podcasts like I have, and you've done however many other episodes, 1,800 episodes, there's no shortage of content of me that I can post on my page. It's already happening. So me putting something on my story isn't necessarily going to do anything, potentially, for this audience. Some people care less now than they used to because the supply of podcasts is just so much higher that the demand of this podcast that this person is on just isn't there anymore, right? And it's way easier to get guests now than it ever has. It's way easier than it's ever been. Podmatch, Matchmaker, podcastguest.com. There's a million different places now. So it's way easier to get guests. That's a whole nother thing. All right, that's another way that guest interviews are changing is if you have a show, you're going to have people reaching out to you if you're on these platforms, most likely. And that's awesome. But if we think of it from like a quality thing, okay, let's think of it this way. Let's say you have a new show and you're getting 20 listens per episode. The people who are going to be reaching out to be on your show aren't necessarily the people that you would be searching for. In the beginning, you're getting guests and you're happy. Heck yeah. But eventually, you have to start taking some bigger shots to get different guests, right? There's not going to be the highest caliber of people on these platforms that are reaching out to you to be on your show. It's kind of like if you think of it from a musical standpoint. If I'm like a Grammy-nominated singer, I'm probably not reaching out to people who are new in the industry to get on their songs. But if I'm new in the industry, I'm reaching out to the Grammy-nominated people to get them on my song. It's kind of that. It's just the levels of success. In the very beginning, I had friends on the podcast because when I first started, I didn't have a name, I didn't have a brand, I didn't have any listens. There was no reason for anybody who was of notoriety, not that my friends weren't notable, but of notoriety to come on the podcast. Then eventually, it gets closer where it's like, well, we have 25,000 downloads. What do you think? And we have a YouTube channel too, and we'll make you social media content. And it's like, oh, this person might come on. And then eventually, you get a big guest, and it's like, well, we had this person on, and that's how things kind of snowball. But on these platforms, it's going to be more a numbers game than anything. I don't think that's a bad thing, but I've had a lot of clients who have said, I'm enjoying these platforms a lot. The only thing is, I feel like everybody and their mother wants to be on the podcast, and some of these people aren't a good fit. Well, now we're talking about setting boundaries and saying, look, this isn't right for me and my audience right now, right? So that's another way things are changing. But my ultimate point with all of that is big guests might not be as big of guests as they used to be in terms of listens. In terms of when you share it, people go crazy. In terms of when they share it on their story or their page, people go crazy. It might not work like it used to because they probably have way more video content out than they ever have. Right? And that kind of goes into the third point I was going to make is shares just might not work like they used to. Just because there's more content. There's more content. I do think the beauty of the more content thing is you can really set yourself apart as an interviewer if you do a lot of research, right? There's so many people have podcasts, and maybe a lot of the people that you're looking to have on have podcasts. Do your research. That is a great way for you to do extra research that honestly, most people aren't going to do. I thought everybody did a lot of research. I really did. I thought everybody did a lot of research before podcast episodes. And then as I started going on shows and going on shows and going on shows, I started to realize that a lot of people don't. A lot of people are using their podcasts as networking tools. A lot of people are using their podcasts to scratch their own itch. And I think that's a great way to do it. But a lot of people just don't do any research. Now, I think the thing that's really going to matter is your ability to do interviews. Your ability to sit down with someone and peel back the curtain and ask the right questions and ask the right follow-up questions and all of that. Your ability as an interviewer is getting more and more and more valuable because as more podcasters come in, as the barrier of entry to interviewing people goes down, your skills will remain one of the most valuable things. So that's another way guest interviews are changing. You have an opportunity to be a really good interviewer because there's a lot of information out there on people. If somebody has a podcast that has 50 episodes, that's a really good way to do research. Almost everybody has social media that's in this space, most likely. Cool. One of my favorite things to do was look at somebody's quote. So a lot of people put up quotes, and I would say, what was going on at that time when you put up that quote? What does that quote mean to you now? What did it mean to you then? What lessons did you learn from whatever? I would just try to get creative with the content that I found and then the questions that I asked later. And last thing I would say for this, on the opposite end, being a guest on podcasts, it's not, I guess it goes back to number 2. It's not like it used to be because it's way easier to get on shows now. As the barrier to entry goes down, usually, not in everything, but oftentimes the value of what you're doing goes down as well. Not always. Not always. But let's say, what's a good example of this? I don't know. Let's say everybody was able to make the same level quality coffee of the nicest coffee shop you have in your town. And you didn't have to buy like a $10,000 machine. You didn't need to do all that. You could just buy instant coffee, put it in a cup, and it was the same level of quality. The value of that kind of goes down because everybody can do it. Right? If somebody's really good at, imagine if everybody on the planet could dunk a basketball. Basketball wouldn't be the same, and the fact that the players in the NBA and some of the players in the WNBA and all the other basketball organizations can dunk, it wouldn't matter that much. Like strong work, 90% of the population can do that. It wouldn't be the same level of value. So I think about that from guesting and having guests on is it's amazing that you have the opportunity to be on more shows and have more guests on, but it just might not be as valuable as it once was. Doesn't mean it's not worth doing. Doesn't mean it shouldn't be a strategy that you're practicing. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do it consistently. I think all of those, you should be doing them. It just might not have the same return on investment that it once did. I think going on podcasts is one of the best things I've ever done. One of the reasons why is because it's helped me answer a lot of questions and get asked things in a different way and be on camera for so many hours. That has helped me tremendously. It's not about the size of the audience. I don't care. I don't ask. Right? I'm not the guy to say, how many people do you have? Oh, if you don't have X amount of audience, I'm not going to come on. Will that happen eventually? I don't know. Maybe. I hope not. I don't really want it to happen. But I also understand that I'm not going to be on the top shows in the world right now. I'm not going to be on every top 100 show. It's just not the way it's going to work right now. So I don't want this to be a negative episode. I just learned very early on that the way we had guests on, it just didn't work for us anymore. And that's okay. You don't have to have guests on. You don't have to do solo episodes. The beautiful thing about podcasting is you can do it the way you want. Is the way you want optimal for results? Maybe not. We are definitely not helping ourselves by not having guests. Because at this stage, we could probably have some pretty big guests on. We're an older podcast. We've been doing it for 7 years. We have a lot of episodes. We had a lot of listens. We had some big guests on in the past. We have some connections now. I just don't know if we're ever going to do it again. Just because, I don't know. It doesn't feel right. And I feel like I have a responsibility to make sure that every guest episode is as accurate as possible. That's my ultimate goal. I don't want someone to learn something on our show that isn't true. It doesn't really work for me. Okay, speaking of guests, I'm going to try something. So in 2 weeks, I'm going to Toronto, Canada, to interview the one and only Evan Carmichael. Evan is the YouTube guy, especially in the self-improvement space. He has, I think, 3.8 million subscribers. He has thousands of videos. He's been doing it for a minute, and he has consulted with some of the most successful people in our sphere when it comes to their YouTube. So I'm going up there to do a training with him. I actually have a very awesome opportunity to do a training for his mastermind, which is amazing. That's a dream come true. And then him and I are going to do an interview. So I'm going to pick his brain on YouTube, interviewing, being a good interviewer or interviewee, both of them. We'll talk all about YouTube and that stuff because obviously if you have a podcast and you have a YouTube channel, I'll make that hopefully valuable for you out there. And that's that. I'm thinking of having guests on this podcast. I'm not sure yet. It kind of connects to what we're saying. So when I have Evan on, I'm going to talk to Evan about the things that he knows really well because it's easy. It's easier to say, I'm going to talk to you about this, 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 and this. I have some other thoughts around guests that I might have on for maybe social media, right? Or maybe speaking. I know some incredible speakers that I think could add a lot of value on the speaking front. But we're going to stick to that topic because that kind of makes the most sense. So that's kind of an example of it. All right. Next week, as I mentioned, we are going to talk about a unique way to get more listens and exposure to a new audience. Will this work for every show? I don't know. I think there's a way to make it work for 99% of shows. And we're going to go into that tomorrow. I know for a lot of us, it's harder than ever to grow. I know. I know. The Apple update hit a lot of people, especially older shows. I know that Instagram is just not what it used to be. I guess maybe social media in general aren't what they used to be. It is probably harder than it's ever been, but it does not mean it's impossible, and it does not mean you can't be successful. We have to get creative. We have to use unique ways, and most importantly, we have to stay consistent. So we'll talk about that next week. As always, if you're interested in a free 30-minute podcast breakthrough session, I will have the link in the show notes. Maybe that's about crafting messages to get guests. Maybe that's about looking into your analytics, artwork, intro, outro, whatever it is, asking better questions. I'm happy to talk about all of those things. Until next week, keep on crushing it, keep on podcasting, and we will talk to you then.